Been a while since I've seen the ground. I'm so used to falling down and getting up, getting back online again.
Brad Kuhn, thank you for joining me and letting me interview you. I came to met Brad Kuhn when he worked with one of my father's friends, Dick Vaux, on this book called Dirty Work, which tells the tale of them picking up the TWA 727 that was hijacked for over a month in the Middle East in 1985. And then the plane sat on the ramp for a couple of months before Dick Vaux, my father, Carl Seeland, went and picked up the plane. And what was really cool was I had heard this story a bunch of times from my dad's perspective. I was in about 7th grade at the time. Seeing the work you did with Dick Vaux on telling it from his perspective was immensely enjoyable to me. I mean, I finished this book, which is about 95 pages long, in about 2 or 3 hours the first day I read it. It was a super fast read. What I'm kind of interested in, aside from any type of notes you might have about the particulars in the story or any research you did, was mechanics of some people hire a ghostwriter, but I'm assuming, correct me if I'm wrong, that Dick found you as just to be a co-writer to help him put this story out. Did you know him ahead of time, or did he reach out to you? How did you guys connect?
Scott, well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be on your podcast, and thank you for thinking of me. Obviously, the person that you should have on here is Dick. Unfortunately, he did pass away shortly, I think within 3 weeks of the book being published. But I will be I'm more than happy to be the sad second fiddle here. But to answer your question, Dick hired me as a straight up ghostwriter. This was a ghostwriting contract. He paid me to help him get his story told. Unfortunately, between the time we began to discuss this and the time we actually began to write it and record his stories, he was suffering from congestive heart failure and was on a fairly accelerated downhill slide that was affecting him both physically and cognitively. So what began as a ghostwriting contract, by the time we finished the manuscript and I turned it over to him, it became clear that he was not going to have the luxury of shopping this manuscript around and trying to get it published traditionally. We also realized that he was not going, that, the time it would take for some additional traditional research to expand the book from the 95 pages that you see to a more, lengthy manuscript, he just wasn't going to have the stamina to do that. So, what we have here is, the life story of an adventure that your father was part of. And, we barely got it out of Dick before he passed. In fact, the first 3 sales of this book were to his hospice nurses who purchased it on Amazon, and he was actually able to sign it before he passed. So he was able to recognize the benefits of being a published author before he passed. So to make a long story short, if that's possible at this point, I was a ghostwriter, and when it became apparent that the traditional publishing route was going to be too long for Dick's current health situation, I offered to publish the book at no additional charge and market it in exchange for co-author credit.
I'm always fascinated in hearing the mechanics of how that works. As far as this book is concerned, it's interesting that you mention the potential for adding a lot more to this to make it more than the 95-page book that it is, because I was thinking as I was reading it that there appeared to be a fair amount of work done just in getting it to those 95 pages. Like, this could have been, one of those long articles that you read in like Outside Magazine or The Atlantic, or of a tale of high adventure that would have been the longer magazine article that you read. But I'm assuming it was you that added in the brief history of the conflict in the Middle East surrounding Israel, and the brief history of hijackings up to that point. Do you want to talk a little bit about your research on that?
Sure. Just a little, my background, I was a professional journalist. As I got started at the Wall Street Journal in Chicago. I moved to Orlando to help start the Orlando Business Journal, and I worked as a reporter for the Orlando Sentinel, big major daily newspaper, in the newsroom for a dozen years. So I have a journalism bachelor's degree from the University of Nebraska. You see the oars behind me, but I wanted to make sure, and anytime I do a story like this, I don't like to have stories hanging out in space. And what often happens, as you know, when you have pilots telling stories, they're just kind of stories that stand on their own. And what distinguishes a book from a bar is, one story between beers at a bar is great, but if you're going to try to call it a book, you have to have some sort of controlling narrative. And so I felt it was my obligation as the ghostwriter on this, and ultimately co-author, was to provide context. Why were all these hijackings taking place in 85? What was it about 85 in particular that made hijacking so popular? What was happening in the Middle East at that time, and in Lebanon in particular, and how did we get there? So, it was very important to me to place this story within the context of its times, the geopolitical context. And that kind of, I think that I've always personally been fascinated by the whole history of the Middle East, the creation of the Israeli state, and all three Abrahamic faiths, and how they interacted there, and how it has contributed, as we see even today with Afghanistan and our 20-year war there. Very timely, I think, to be having this conversation as we withdraw from a protracted and frustrating engagement in the Middle East. It kind of parallels some of the things we talk about in the book.
I found myself being surprised at how much I feel impacted and by what's going on over there. And having never served in the military or anything, I just feel impotent as to do anything. I've heard different opinions, and this isn't a criticism of any one politician or anything, but I've a lot of friends in the service right now are reaching out, and we're talking, and they're struggling with their sense of meaning and purpose, and everything that's been done over there to have it end like this, where the Taliban is retaking control and going to treat women and children the way that they have, and and I'm not here to
No, it's terrible. I mean, but it also speaks volumes that after 20 years of assistance and $1 trillion of military training and equipment and guidance, there was no will within the country to defend itself. The government of the country that we had been protecting turned it all over and said, we quit. And you have to wonder how many more years and how many more lives you can invest in a situation like that.
Yeah, and I don't know the answer. One comment that was made from a friend was that we've had 0 deaths militarily in Afghanistan since February of 2020, and so it's kind of counter to the narrative of like that this is a forever war. I mean, sure, it's an investment in people, but one of the things I'm kind of struggling with is if we claim to be on the moral high ground as a country, that our ideals matter in the world, then how do we not create the sense of, well, we're pulling out of there because it's too expensive? because if the death toll isn't really a thing or a reason, are we pulling out because of money? And you know, and like I said, like listen, this isn't pointing finger at any one political administration. I'm not playing politics. I happen to just have a sense, because we're friends on social media, our views typically tend to be more closely aligned than different. It's just I'm really finding myself really unsettled by the present situation.
Well, and that's one of the things that one of the reasons I think I wanted to address the geopolitical context within the framework of the hijacking of TWA Flight 847. All we ever really knew, I think most people knew, was what we had seen on the news. And I think even in a broader context, what we saw in the Chuck Norris movie and the subsequent Lindsay Wagner movie about the hijacking itself, and we always kind of tend to rally around these things and look at the tragedy of the individual event and not back up and really look at how we got to that event. And I think that was, I think long term, I think short term, the idea of getting Dick's story on the page was the mission. But I think longer term, the significance of this book is going to be the documentation of the context in which all of this occurred. And, I think it was important to put it in the book because it established that tension. I think it could be argued that, TWA was insured. This plane was insured. They could have written that whole thing off and left it on the tarmac. So, logic says they're not going to send their pilots into harm's way for an insurable loss. So on the one hand, we have this great story of risk and swashbuckling. On the other hand, you have this sense, well, how much danger were they really in? And I think that's why it was important to talk about what was happening at the airport around them, why there was a narrow window of opportunity, where were they protected and where were they not? Yeah. And, what was exactly the nature of the risk they faced versus the sort of the escalating adventure that occurs over time in exchange for a free drink at a bar.
That's a really interesting point. And your point about this potentially having been an insurable loss, I was struck by that, reading the book, because I'm an airline captain today. And I remember my he had a profound sense of duty towards his job in TWA. Like, I think he called in sick once in 20 years because he would preach to me, if I call in sick, then I'm just screwing the next guy down the line, and they're going to have to go work and do the job that I'm not. And I have a hard time imagining pilots in the present day, just not even 40 years, fast forward into history, going into a civil war zone to reclaim an airplane out of a sense of duty to their company. Yeah. I just, maybe it's possible, maybe it's plausible, but and not to kind of be waxing nostalgic towards the old days, but I really think that there was this different sense of duty. And I
think that's an area I would have loved to have explored more if Dick had been feeling better, and if so much time hadn't passed, or if I'd been able to reach some of the TWA executives when their memories were a little sharper. I was able to talk to former President Dick Pearson, but your dad had passed, and so many of the people that were involved in the decision making had passed. I tried, TWA was a special place from everything I can gather. And I enjoyed very much looking into. I tried to kind of draw a comparison of the hijacking, facing terrorists at home and abroad, because at this time all of this was taking place. You had terrorists hijacking a plane, and then you had two, not one, but two leverage buyout guys trying to take over the airline. So TWA and all of its executives were fighting this hijacking on the, they'd work their daytime fighting a hostile corporate takeover on two fronts. And then they'd be up all night fighting terrorists on Beirut time. And to me, I think while I may have gotten into this from the from the Dick Vaux angle, that's possibly the most fascinating part to me, because it brings in the whole context of Ollie North and Robert McFarland and Arms for Hostages and the whole Reagan era, and it was a fascinating time. I mean, I think Naabi Berri, who was at the time the justice minister of Beirut, he was also the guy that was kind of the unreliable negotiator in all this. He was the guy that was the U.S. contact in terms of keeping the hostages safe. And as we write about in the book, he was also at one point the chief pirate, in the sense that shortly after Navy diver Robert Steedham was shot and his body was thrown out on the tarmac, Naabi Berri made a move that on the one hand could be interpreted as trying to gain control of the situation by getting his people onto the plane and marshaling the hostages and getting them into safe hands. On the other hand, he didn't turn those hostages loose right away, because he had a political agenda that he had to deal with as the head of kind of the establishment Sunni or Shia militia, the Amal, facing the more radical Shia militia that had just formed Hezbollah. And it was the Hezbollah hijackers that had taken the plane, and they were a little bit, they had less to lose. They were less politically connected, and this was their time to shine, which is why they hijacked the plane. They had no other way to get the international attention. Naabi Berri had the added complications of being a political climber. He was a relative newcomer on the scene. He's still the, I believe he's not prime minister, but head of the parliament in Lebanon right now, which is incredible. I mean, this is the guy who was in charge in 1985, is still a top government official in Beirut, in Lebanon today. And he was the guy there that let the hijackers go, let them disappear off the plane. But after those hijackers were removed from the plane, no other hostages were injured, and they were clearly treated a lot better. But at the same time, they were removed from the plane and secreted around Beirut so that the Navy SEALs and other rescue efforts would not be feasible.
Do you remember how long they were in the Amal's control before they were released?
I'm trying to think of how many days, though. I think the whole thing took like 21 days or something like that, or close to it. And most of that time, that the switch took place after a couple of days. So it was the original hijackers were only on the plane for a couple of days. So most of the time that the hijackers, or that the captives were held in Beirut, they were actually under the control of Naabi Berri.
Okay. As far as the crew of the hijacked airplane, did you make any attempts to reach out to John Testrake or Phil Maresca?
I did, but unfortunately, both John Testrake and
Phil Maresca.
What?
The first officer was Phil Maresca.
I did not reach out to Phil Maresca. I tried. John Testrake had passed away of cancer. I also found out that the purser,
Uli Derrickson.
Yes, Uli Derrickson had also passed away.
Okay.
So I wasn't able to reach. I kind of reached out to the actual crew. I did not reach out to the first officer.
Okay.
I was able to reach, after the book published, finally, I was able to finally reach Carl Seeland from your dad's flight.
Okay.
And he was able to add some insights and clarify some things that may have confused, that Dick may have conflated over time.
Okay.
Because once the memory establishes a narrative, it kind of smooths over conflicts to make that narrative more coherent. And I think there were a couple of instances where Dick's memory was a little bit foggy on things.
Do you have an example of one of those that stood out?
Well, the best example is that, contemporary accounts by Dick in the media talked about how the plane was in relatively good shape on the inside. In the book, he talks about how all of the seats were shredded and, everything had been stripped out of the plane and all of that. Well, Carl told me later that the plane physically inside was in decent shape, and that, I've got some pictures from Dick that shows him in the cabin, or in the passenger cabin, and it was in fact stripped fairly bare. But Carl said, no, that wasn't the way it was when we flew it back. And so he was suggesting that perhaps, Dick had been able to get onto the plane after it had been turned over to the FBI, and the FBI was disassembling the plane, looking for bombs and things like that. And that the pictures, some of which are in the book, were actually taken after the fact, after the plane had been recovered and turned over to government authorities. And what supports that claim is, if you think about it, they all flew in uniform. They were all wearing the uniforms with the epaulets. But then when you look at the picture of Dick in the cabin there, looking things over, he's wearing looks like a members only jacket.
Yeah. I'm looking at the picture right now.
So, I think in his mind, it was absolutely real. That was the condition that the plane was in when they recovered it, but that was not Carl's memory. And it would make sense that if it all happened kind of all at once, and then, several years passed, that maybe Dick may have confused which, at what point the plane was stripped.
So not to get pedantic about the technical aspects of book producing, but I find it very interesting. I've got one of the first printed versions of this book. And I remember reaching out to you shortly after it came out, because I was really interested and excited and very happy to be able to talk about it with you. And I've got this. I remember correcting this picture right here, where and in my version it says Carl Seeland finds one of the cabin pillowcases, but it's got 3 stripes. And I remember having this picture, my dad having this picture, and and that was just kind of also speaks to the sometimes sophomoric nature of my father, that he would put on the terrorists, pillowcase as a joke. But I was really interested that you were able to just go in and edit things on your end, and subsequent versions of this book that I've given out to friends, it says Jim Corley finds one of the cabin pillowcases. And so have you done the same with these pictures of the cabin? Have you changed that, or do they?
No, because at the very beginning of the book, it's like my job as co-author and as ghostwriter initially is to try to verify as many facts as I could.
Yeah.
And for the most, I kind of put a disclaimer up there that says, this was Dick's story. This was Dick saying, Brad my co-author has spent a considerable amount of time trying to verify all of this, but there may still be, memory being what it is. This is how I remember it. There may be, some anomalies. If so, I'm sorry, but this is my story and this is how I remember it. And I think in situations like that, where, it's he said, she said, whatever, I kind of left it. But in that case, you were absolutely right. You could show the verification. Okay, the shoulder insignia there is very clearly the first officer.
Yeah.
And that was a documentable correction that I could make. And because these books are printed, print on demand, basically the book doesn't exist until it is ordered, and then it is printed to order.
Yeah.
There's no inventory of books that needs to be corrected. So as soon as I was made aware of an error, a verifiable error, I went ahead and fixed it, and every subsequent copy was reflected the updated information.
As an author and a ghostwriter, are you excited about the present day shift to that style of book production?
Well, yes and no, and here's why. And we may be getting a little bit didactic about it, because not everybody cares as much as I do, or maybe you do, about publishing. But say back in 1970, when you'd go to a bookstore at the mall, Little Professor or B. Dalton booksellers, and there might be 1,000 to 1,500 books on the shelves. And most of those were all put out by the big publishing companies. There were 25,000 total books in print in the world, and the rest were older books that didn't sell. So they were no longer in print. They had been remaindered, and you just couldn't get those books except used.
Yeah.
And there was a whole series of bookstores where they trafficked in used books. Well, then the big box retailers came along, and now there was room for 100,000 books on the shelves. And so now all of a sudden there were more books in print, and they were less likely to take the books out of circulation. Well, then Amazon and Barnes and Noble Online and all these folks started coming up with print on demand. And so now pretty much any book that's ever been printed, including, they have over, I think after 99 years, a copyright expires. And so a book becomes public domain and can be printed by anyone for free.
Okay.
So now virtually any book that's ever been in print can be put up online as a print on demand. And so on Amazon, there are more than 60 million books in print.
Wow.
So wouldn't you rather compete against 25,000 titles versus 60 million titles?
Yeah.
So on the one hand, it really lowered the bar, the barriers to entry, and has made it much more democratic, because you don't have to go through the gatekeepers anymore. Now, if you're like me and you have a background in publishing and you produce professionally designed and edited books, it's a great opportunity. But it also creates an opportunity for people to kind of slap some stuff together, half-ass a cover and put it out there. So there are a lot of books out there that just, probably shouldn't be. And I'll tell you that of all those 60 million books, to be one of the top 10,000, you only need to sell 20 books a week.
Okay.
So most of the books out there are not selling that much. Even the ones put out by the big publishing houses, it's a very small percentage of the books put out even by the big publishers, sell 100,000 copies.
Well, it's like the what is it, the Matthew principle, or it's a Pareto distribution, where success builds upon itself, and to those that have more will be given. And just there's only so much attention span, from the collective hive, the hive mind that is, our human consciousness and where we focus it. And so, but one of the things I'm trying to do with this podcast, well, first and foremost, I'm guided solely by my interest, but given that I am a pilot, I'm going to be focusing that interest a fair amount on things related to aviation and airlines and whatnot. And not always. Like, I just had a great friend a great conversation with a friend who just opened up his own Chevy dealership in North Carolina that he owns, which that's no small feat to go from a kid who, was enlisted in the Marine Corps to, building up to that. And I think that's an interesting story, but pivoting back to talking about aviation, I know that there are a ton of great aviation stories, and and something you said about 10 minutes ago really resonated with me. You talked about, stories at the bar over a beer, and you helping mold this into, an actual printable story. And, I'm just wondering, are you still in the market for ghostwriting? Is that something you're still interested to do? Because if this podcast or interview meets any of my goals that I would like for it to achieve, as far as, being seen in the aviation community, I know that there are plenty of people who have more stories to be told. In fact, I was just flying with someone the other day who was, had so many fun stories of bush flying up in Alaska that he said, a friend and his were talking about starting a book. Like, is that something that you're still interested in?
Very much. I mean, I've actually written more than a dozen ghost-written books. The book Dirty Work is one of the few that has my name on it. In fact, it was kind of strange after Dick passed, where I was going around speaking to TARPA and some of the other pilot organizations on his behalf, because he wasn't around to do it himself. It was strange to be the author out front, because I'm usually the guy behind the scenes. I love the craft of making books. I make good books. I love crafting the covers. I love making sure that the content is pristine, that the book is well designed, and that the design and the font, everything down to the fonts, match the personality of the book. I like doing audiobooks where I find just the right voice. You'll find that there's an audiobook of Dirty Work, and I've got a guy who, it's very, he kind of has his own like right-wing radio show where his sponsors are Ollie North and the NRA, and he's got that real gruff kind of soldier of fortune voice that's perfect for telling this tale. But I produce ebooks. I produce print on demand, both on Amazon and on Ingram Spark, which is the one that, bookstores go to Ingram when they want to carry a book in the store.
Okay.
And then I work with Audible to put audiobooks out. But it takes several months of my life. This book took 6 months to put together. So it's a big financial commitment on behalf of the client that wants to do this. And, for Dick, he was willing to make that investment.
That's really neat. Pivoting back more central to the story. One of the things that popped up here is the sense of camaraderie that exists. Dick Vaux talks about how he called John Testrake to let him know that he got the plane back, and the sense of camaraderie that he had. And then also, I forget the name, but when he called his friend in flight ops, who he didn't realize he had the phone on speaker, and the whole board of directors was listening as they were giving each other, the business and sharing expletives to each other. And then everything breaks out in laughter.
Yeah, that would be Dick Kenny.
Yeah. And I'm just sort of struck by the sense of, camaraderie that is built by in delving into those tough situations, by delving into the conflict. Someone who, not to jump ahead, but I was also going to ask you at the end of this about your interview with Paul Marhofer on your trucking podcast that you do. And he writes that the best trucking songs are about, a tragedy, or all good stories, I've heard Aaron Sorkin say, involve some sort of conflict. And I'm just wondering what you think about, like, do you think it's the nature of that our sense of closeness that we create with other people is actually through shared stories, and that all good stories involve some type of tension and conflict? Dick Vaux reaching out to John Testrake, or the conflict that he has with his friend in flight ops, or, I remember, we went skiing with Phil Maresca, who was the first officer on the hijack plane, John Testrake's first officer out in Snowbird, Utah. And my sense is that all of that camaraderie is just built out of a shared tension, a shared conflict. Talk about that in storytelling, if you don't
Sure.
mind.
It is, conflict obviously is central to any good story, because it's that tension and the desire to see how the story ends. What happens next? It's like, and then what? And then what? And then what? And, there's a hope that things turn out well. Obviously, in a case where the story is being told by the narrator, that the narrator survived. But there is that kind of, you kind of like to have those unresolved conflicts and a stepwise kind of progression toward resolution. And it's funny, people don't necessarily know it, but there's a shape to a book where they're used to finding out and having things really start to come together, and the action building 3/4 of the way through the book. And so part of my job as a ghostwriter is to understand the basic shape of a narrative and to keep that contract, that unwritten contract with the reader, so that their experience of reading a book checks with kind of their prior experience of what reading a book should feel like.
Yeah.
Now, back to the camaraderie and conflict, there is that sense of shared experience. People want to be able to relate to the experience of your protagonist. In this case, I think a lot of pilots were people that bought the book because they've been there, done that. He was also a fighter pilot, as I think your dad was, and having been through that experience as well. I mean, these guys all have their stories, and they like to hear other people's stories and relate them and compare them to their own. Okay, well, he was in William Tell. Then how did he do? I know that I finished this well. Then, how did he do? And what were the conditions? And, and then they'll tell the story about, losing track of a missile and having it hit a shrimp boat, and all the other pilots will either call shenanigans or believe it.
Yeah.
And I think even if they don't believe it, they can appreciate the gift of gab that goes into the telling of the story, because they've all kind of embellished their own narratives and legends as well. So even if the story doesn't prove to be 100% true, they respect the telling of it.
I like that. I like that. That's a great way to put it. And you're kind of rekindling the sense of when I was a flight instructor at Somerset Airport in Bedminster, New Jersey. One of the coolest things about that job would be the days where the weather was too low to go out flying, and maybe some students had canceled, and you're sitting around the airport with, yourself, and on good days, a lot of, some older and more experienced pilots who are just, spinning yarns, telling stories, most of which are true, and it's really funny that you say respect the fact that they told the story, because, this one of the tribal elders at the airport was a guy named Lou Rehr. And there's actually a book written about his tales in World War II called Marauder. He was a highly decorated B-26 pilot. And I didn't know any of that at the time. Lou was just an old guy to me, and he was a designated examiner who gave me my private pilot's license when I was 17 years old, when I was a senior in high school. And he was just really quiet, but he was always had a smile on his face, and he would sometimes listen, sometimes he'd be in the other room, sometimes he'd just be sitting in the room and listening. as us young, cocky flight instructors were flexing our knowledge by talking about certain things and trying to sort of one up each other in an all too common for that level of experience, trying to show off our feathers, so to speak, of how much we knew and what stories we had and what we did with this student and that student. And something about just what you just said of respect the fact of telling the story is just, there was such a generousness of his wisdom, and it was actually quite humbling for me. After I had worked there for, 6 months to a year, they had his 80th birthday party, and they put up all these displays for all of the things that this guy had accomplished in his life that I had never known, multiple Distinguished Flying Crosses, the French version of the Distinguished Flying Cross, setting glider records in the 60s for gliding an aircraft for over, I think, 24 hours. And he flew a glider from Boca Raton, Florida up to Tipton, Georgia, and just had done all these amazing things. And here I've been, trying to look like, Mr., great pilot in front of him. And it's quite embarrassing, but I'm rambling on a bit. We'll see what gets edited out of this.
Let me share maybe a tangible example of a story and how it goes from plausible reality to pilot legend. Dick tells a story in the book, and he tells it as fact. And for all I know, it could be fact. But this is his story, so therefore it's fact to him. But he was before he flew for TWA, he was a pilot in the Maine Air National Guard. And they would fly training runs, along the East Coast. And there was a bridge there in Maine called the Bucksport Bridge. And there was legend around the base, and had been for years, that, of pilots and their daring do who would, fly under the bridge on, up the Penobscot River and buzz the tank, fly under the bridge and buzz Bucksport and head back to base. Well, that's obviously potentially problematic if you do that. And so, that constant asking of, and then what, and then what, and then what. And the story, as Dick tells it, it's not that he heard a story about somebody who did that, or that they always wanted to. It became, he did that. And then it's like, well, okay, how do you address the fact that if you did something like that, they would bust you bad, for taking that kind of risk with government property, and they would kick you out, or at least, clip your wings for a while.
Yeah.
So the story evolved into, he didn't only fly under the bridge once, but he flew under the bridge twice and did 2 loops. And it was the second pass under the bridge that saved his career, because he was flying solo, and the report was that 2 jets flew under the bridge. So this story became plausible. It had a realistic ending. It's like, oh yeah, well, of course, when they would call to complain, he had plausible deniability. But, realistically, you're a pilot. That a young man full of testosterone would certainly want to do that. You also know the severe amount of trouble they would get in for flying under a bridge with a deck 300 feet off the ground.
Yeah.
at Mach speed, and then pulling up and doing a loop, and then not only doing a loop, but getting their bearings again and coming around for a second pass right outside of a town. So I don't know that the story would hold up under scrutiny, but you have to respect the telling of it and the way it has evolved over time.
Yeah. And just like we talked about, all good stories have conflict. I have just in listening to that story, just a little sense of an internal conflict, because part of me, sort of agrees with you with your sense of like, this might not have happened because the risks or whatnot. But one of the things I'm wondering as you're saying it is, today in 2021, Yeah, you definitely do not fly a military jet under a bridge unauthorized in Maine, close to civilian populations. But I do have a sense that back in the early 60s that there might have been a little bit of a different culture, which lends a little bit of plausibility. Now, as far as the double loop, I don't know. I don't know. I would definitely lean to he definitely flew under the bridge. Where it goes from there, yeah, I see what you're saying. I respect the story.
But what's also interesting is that the stories he didn't tell, he told that story. He told the story of dropping a bomb through a shrimp boat during the William Tell games. But there were stories that really happened to him that he didn't tell, like cartwheeling a plane that malfunctioned on landing, where the landing gear didn't fully lock in. It said it was locked in, but they could kind of tell from the sound that it hadn't. And as it landed, it crumpled and the plane cartwheeled, and he did some pretty amazing things to avoid injury to himself and his two-seat.
Yeah.
And there was some actual amazing and heroic stuff that he did. At the same time, he'll talk about flying and teasing Russian jets over when flying out of a secret base in France. And others of the contemporaries of him said, no, we never actually engaged the Russians. Others did, but in our others that we flew with did, but our particular plane did not. And here's why. But so it's funny. He would downplay some of the legitimately awesome things.
Yeah.
And he would turn some of these stories into almost set pieces, like a comedian has his tight 10 minutes of material. And I think pilots kind of developed their own tight 10 of daring do.
That's really, I think that's an accurate mental model. Hey, do you have any recollection? He mentions in the book about flying a TWA 727 near the border of was it Iraq and Iran?
Yeah.
Did you do any research on that one?
No, because and it was hard. It was one of those that was hard to trace. He was flying cargo, and he said that often you would have top secret military cargo that would be in a plane and it would be undeclared. And he was saying in that particular case, the whole plane was, flying without identification, but it was easily identified by visual reference from the ground. And he was trying to fly along the border to deliver this cargo. They were being told to land the plane, and he just pushed through and was able to get safely to its destination.
Okay.
That's another story that is him recounting another tense moment in his career. It's a story that I know for a fact that he told numerous times. It's not one that I could verify, because it was kind of one of those things where the cargo, which he assumed to be munitions, was not supposed to be on a civilian plane.
Yeah.
And so there's not a lot of official record that I could go to. I have to take his word for it. And that's where it kind of defaults to, this is his book. I am his instrument. I am his pen. I am his typewriter. And my job is to produce a cohesive narrative and kind of work some of the rough edges that will get others to call, that others would definitely call shenanigans on and claim that that's not true. So that's one of those stories that he says it's true. I have no reason to believe it wasn't.
Sure.
It passes the sniff test to me, and it seems like that's certainly something that could plausibly have happened. And
oh yeah, I'm pretty sure that, especially back then, many of the well-known carriers were doing, a lot of work for the military. I mean, I read Robert Gant's book, Sky Gods, about the fall of Pan Am, which, the title says the fall of Pan Am, but the book really strikes me more as the story of the total arc of Pan Am, and the amount of work that they did, in Vietnam was really, awesome. I mean, just awe-inspiring as far as, nowadays you think of, C-17s moving troops back and forth and whatnot, but back then it seemed like most of the airlift was really done by airlines like Pan Am and TWA. Sort of wrapping up this book, and I just, after this, I just want to talk a little bit about your podcasting endeavors. Did you have a chance to talk to Carl Seeland about the wire harness issue?
Yeah, he basically said that he has no personal knowledge of it, but he had no reason to question what Dick said about it.
Yeah.
And so, again, that's one of those things where the sands of time have kind of scoured people's memories. As flight engineer, he certainly would have seen what was happening on the instruments. It was my conversation with Carl that led me to kind of delve deeper into some of these other stories and recognize that the Dick's memory of them may have
molded it in a different.
Yeah. I mean, and it's like you said, you have to have conflict in every story. And I think he had a sense of, what makes a good story.
Yeah. Well, listen, to just wrap up on this book, and for anyone listening who is potentially looking for a ghostwriter for their book, if I'm hearing you right, this is one of the very few books you got the co-author credit on, because you do more of your work in ghostwriting, which probably is harder to market than I'm guessing. But
yeah, all of my business comes from referral.
Okay, because this is, I don't know that I've read a book this quickly, I mean, for the length of it. It's just, and I've got the type of brain where I might finish 1 out of 4 books that I start, because if I'm not interested in it, I cannot keep reading it. And I think you did a superb job as far as the flow of the writing. Everything just flows so quickly, and to me that's the sign of a great read, that you can finish it.
Thank you, Scott. I love what I do, and I always have great respect for my clients and co-authors, and that it's their story. My job as a ghost is to be a ghost, but by the same token, I don't want to get them in trouble. I respect their story, but I also try to make sure that the way we tell it doesn't come back on them in a way that has an unintended consequence.
That's great. If you're still listening at this point in the conversation, I'm hoping that on some level you find listening to be of some value. All I ask in return for your enjoyment of this podcast is to share it with someone. Anyone. Social media would be great, but sharing it with one friend would still be doing me a favor. I'm really enjoying this journey I'm on in creating this content. The best way you can help me is by subscribing to my podcast and my YouTube channel and sharing this content with others. Thanks so much for helping. All right, so tell me about your project with White Line Fever.
Sure. In addition to the work I do in print, I do audio and video broadcasting. So I am an on-air personality for a company called the Opportunity Media Group out of Oklahoma City. And they produce news and entertainment content for truckers, streaming news and entertainment. So it started as the Truck Boss Show, which is streaming video segments where I am their regulatory correspondent, and I kind of unpack some of the harder issues for them. But they recently launched a podcast called Bosscast. And as part of that podcast, I was asked to kind of do one of my storytelling ventures by looking into the origins of trucking music and dig up some of the sort of lesser known stories behind popular or famous trucking songs, particularly exploring the relationship between trucking songs and the history of country music. And I call it White Line Fever.
And why do you call it White Line Fever?
Well, that's number one. There's a song called White Line Fever, but it's kind of that whole, I tried to come up with something that would evoke that passion for the road, that danger of the road, that kind of hypnotism of the white line down the middle. Without, I try not to be too on the nose. Like with the book, I called it Dirty Work because it just, I look for that narrative title that tells you something about the book, but without being too obvious. So White Line Fever was a story that people would know the title of the song, but it says so much also about what it's like to be a trucker that I felt like it did a lot of heavy lifting as a title.
Yeah. I felt a particular kinship in listening to Paul Marhoefer, because you have a sense that there's that Marhoefer comes from a different clan than most truckers, that he's coming from like this intellectual class of people, but he just can't make his brain fit in with that. And he finds, something soothing and calming about, the manual labor. It's kind of very evocative of like, when you hear Mike Rowe talking about dirty jobs or something, and I'm not to call trucking a dirty job. It's most certainly not, but it certainly is, more boots on the ground, hard labor and hard work.
John Marhoefer is an interesting story. He's an interesting guy. Like you said, he was an English major, something he doesn't talk about to his trucking buddies at the truck stop, but he also is a long haul trucker and has been for a long, long time. He had a near fatal accident back in, I believe it was 2009. He had a souped up truck and was putting in the long hours and living the trucker life and living a little fast, and ended up in a horrific accident that they didn't think he was going to survive. And it actually gave him this incredible gravelly voice that kind of gives him like a Haggard or a Dylan sound. And as he said in the podcast, he said, I wouldn't recommend it as a way to further your singing career, but he said it did turn out to give me a distinctive sound. Marhoefer, I think if you haven't listened to it yet, he narrates or hosts a podcast that's no longer in production, but it was there for about a year, called Over the Road or On the Road. I think it was Over the Road. And it was it was produced by PRX, the public radio powerhouse, and Overdrive magazine. And so you can hear Paul actually serving as host and interviewing other truckers, plus telling some of his own stories in his own words on that podcast. And that's actually, it had millions of listeners, and it won all kinds of awards. So I would recommend the Paul Marhoefer podcast.
I'll definitely check it out. So the most recent one you did, a 6-day haul from
6 days on the road. And that's a pretty, I think almost anybody who's listened to any country music has heard that song, because the refrain is basically, or the hook is 6 days on the road and I'm going to make it home tonight. It's that whole thought about, that getting home to the wife, the girl, the family, after a lot of work on the road. And it goes through all of the different things that the loneliness of the road, the hassles of the weigh-ins, trying to make deadlines and avoiding getting, caught speeding, doing what you have to do to stay awake, especially in the previous, pre-regulated times when, truckers were known for, popping the little white pills, just to kind of keep alert.
Yeah.
And it's a song that has been out there, and it was made popular by a kind of a, typical cowboy troubadour singer, Dave Dudley, back in the early 60s. And people thought that Dave Dudley wrote it, but it was written by two guys that were actually linoleum haulers, flooring haulers out of Muscle Shoals, Alabama. And they were, in fact, affiliated with what would become known as the whole Muscle Shoals sound that Leonard Skinner sang about, the Swampers.
Yeah.
And they were just two partner drivers that were on their way up to Philadelphia or Pittsburgh, hauling flooring for a flooring company out of Alabama. And they just wrote about their trip, and it became a big hit. And there was the one big hit for the one, it was a duo that wrote it, and one of them, that was his only big hit. The other one wrote another one, which I think a lot of drivers could relate to, which is about a driver, a rookie driver, who just never, got his license, hurried up onto the road, and he can drive straight okay, but he can't back up. And so the song is called "Give Me 40 Acres and I'll Turn This Rig Around."
Yeah, that's hysterical. I've got a friend who's a lawyer, and he's a lawyer in part because he failed his commercial driver's test. He tried to go work for JB Hunt, and he ended up getting the truck stuck in the mud, and he pissed off the driver's test examiner so much they had to walk back through the mud to get back to where they were going. And when we figured out that trucking wasn't for him, and he became a lawyer.
Well, we all have to settle.
Well, and that's the interesting thing, and the I wonder if there's a sense in trucking similar to the many airline pilots will refer to 2002 to 2012 as the lost decade. In the decade after 9/11, there were severe cuts. There were 35% pay cuts. No one felt appreciated. We didn't feel respected by the public. And what you had to do at the start of your career to make it, where you'd go and work for a regional airline, literally making less than what someone would make flipping burgers at McDonald's, for a job that we felt had, significant import, was very demoralizing. And as I was listening to your most recent White Line Fever, about the 6-day haul from Muscle Shoals to Pittsburgh, something just got me reflecting how I remember being a kid. I was born in early 70s, watching things like BJ McKay and Smokey and the Bandit. And I had this sense that, trucking was cool. Hey, is that an 18-wheeler? Or is that a 10-wheeler? Does that truck have even more than 18 wheels? And one of the tension I have in my head right now as I'm thinking about it is discerning how much of that was because I was a kid and things were coming from entertainment and music that were sort of glamorizing trucking, and how much of that as times really have shifted. But I'm wondering if there's a shared sense among truckers that it's kind of like them against the world right now.
There is. I think there's a great parallel between independent owner operators in particular and pilots. I think that you've got a large piece of machinery, 80,000 pounds fully loaded, great deal of responsibility, especially once you've logged a few million miles on, several years on the road. You know that if you're driving a cattle truck, when to juke to get all the cattle to shift in the right direction so that you don't tip it on the turn. Same thing with when you're hauling a tanker. When you're a tanker yanker, you got to know exactly how to juke the load so that it works in your favor on the turn instead of against you.
Yeah.
As a pilot, you have to do the same kind of thing with winds and shear and all that kind of stuff. But they get disrespected very much. There are people that, the retailers where they deliver will make them wait to unload. They won't want them to come in and use their bathrooms. They're made to wait in unpaid time at either end of the load to pick up or to unload. It's called lumping time, or retention time. And so they get paid for the miles they drive, and then the hours that they sit there and wait for somebody to take the load off, or to connect the load, is unpaid time often. Then you've got all of these slip and fall lawyers, the tort lawyers, that are after them because they see the narrative of the big intimidating truck, damaging the small vulnerable four-wheeler. Even though four-wheelers cause 85% or more, they're at fault in an accident with a truck.
Really?
Most of the time, it's usually a small car doing something stupid that causes that the trucker doesn't have the physical ability to react to in a reasonable time. But they vilify the truckers for the sake of making an insurance claim, in court. So
Sure.
there's just a lot of folks with their hand in a trucker's pocket, including brokers and other folks that, are just looking for a way to make a buck. And the average independent owner operator, there's a few 100,000 of those out there. They don't have any leverage. So they kind of have to, who was it that, I think Huey Lewis sings about, I'm taking what they're given because I'm working for a living.
Yeah.
And that's kind of how they feel. They feel that everybody's got it in for them. Nobody respects them or treats them like the highway heroes they are. And so there's actually a big Facebook group out there called the Disrespected Trucker that has some really good feedback back and forth on. And there's another one called Stop the Tires, which is, kind of the trucker legend is that, one of these days, the only way we're going to get hurt is if we all pull over and stop driving, then they'll have to listen. And unfortunately, there's mortgages to pay and food to put on the kids to feed. And, for every trucker that's willing to pull it over and stop to make a statement, there's 10 more willing to haul that load. So they just don't have the leverage that they need to control their own lives. And so they do take what the market will bear.
And sometimes that makes a hard living, for what the market will bear.
But I will say it is also a decent living for a lot of these independents that own their own truck. They've developed, especially the ones that have developed a specialty such as heavy hauls or tanking, or something that requires a certain level of skill, especially if they go out and they get their regular customers where they've contracted on their own and they have a locked in rate. That's a decent living. A lot of the folks that have to live off the spot market have to live off of, take the rate that's on offer. That's a little harder, especially if they're trying to make a truck payment.
You seem like you've got like a pretty strong emotional connection to truckers. What's the source of that affinity?
I mentioned it when I talked about the authors earlier too. I mean, when I work with an author, there was an old saying, no tears in the writer, no tears in the reader.
Yeah.
You have to, there's a thing called verisimilitude or truthfulness. I think George Bush called it truthiness.
Yeah.
I think to be believable, you have to be authentic, and to be authentic, you have to like your subjects. And I truly like and respect truckers. We don't always have the same politics. We don't agree on a lot of things. They probably, would have trouble understanding why people pay me my phony baloney salary to write instead of drive. I don't know that they would consider me to be as a productive member of society as they are. But I respect them, and I love the wisdom of experience. And I think truckers are people who are just full of the wisdom of experience. And so many times they're also the good Samaritan of biblical days. They're the person that will look out for others on the road. They're kind of the hall monitors of the road. And while they get vilified, they're also in many cases the first ones to pull over and do what they can to help when they see trouble on the road.
You used the phrase there, the wisdom of experience. And I was just talking about it with my last guest, as far as the reason why I'm doing these podcasts. It was born out of a frustration. I was finding myself, this time last year, spending way too much time on social media, way too much time stoking up my own political opinions and fervor. And don't get me wrong, I think, having a strong sense of your political opinions, in right measure in life is part of being a rounded person. But I think for many people, including myself, the scales are wildly off balance. If you're, spending a lot of time every day listening to, pundits on the right or the pundits on the left talking about why your political team is in the right and the other is in the wrong and whatnot, it's seriously a misguided sense of time. And as far as you referencing the wisdom of experience, what I'm trying to capture here, or just, create another reflecting point that can get put out in the ether, there is just, people having a place to come and look and go like, hey, like what I think is interesting here is, here's a guy that makes his living, writing stories and telling stories, and you gain a sense of your sincerity by doing it. And it's a way to live a life. If we're spending our time putting all of our attention to, why I should agree or disagree with Ben Shapiro, it's who's that helping?
Yeah. And the important thing to remember, and we talked about it at the opening of this segment, is the basic tool of a storyteller is conflict. And a talking head on television doesn't care if you like what they're saying or you hate what they're saying, as long as you're tuning in to hear what they're saying.
Exactly.
And the more controversial they can be, the more successful they are, because people get to watch the ads in between. And, I think part of what we've gone through in the last few years that's most destructive is not what one party says or the other, but the success with which outside influences have been able to drive us from the middle to the extremes. And so much of what we do on a day-to-day basis exists in the middle, and the actual time that we spend in the extremes is very small. But right now we seem to define each other in the extremes, and it creates a great deal of conflict and unrest and difficulty. I mean, when we start politicizing public health, when we start, fighting each other over one group's willingness to, wear a piece of cloth over their face to try to, in the name of helping people, it becomes somehow a party affiliation. When we start fighting over vaccinations, and trying to suggest that, there's some greater agenda that, again, pick your extreme to which that agenda goes, whether we're tagging everybody with a chip or we're trying to sterilize people or what it is. It's just absolutely crazy. But what is it at its core? We've got a disease, we've got a potential fix, and people on both sides actually want people to take the fix so that we don't spread it. It's like, if you see poison ivy, you don't go step in it because it's your right to step in it.
Yeah.
You know that it's going to make you itch and burn, so you leave it alone.
Yeah. Back to the theme of conflict, for me, I feel like I have just in the past, I don't know, a couple weeks to a month or so, overcome the mental hurdles of being able to put this podcast out there, being able to actually do the interviews. I had so much fear of, or allowing the critical voices in my head to get in the way, dealing with imposter syndrome and listening to those voices that would just say, well, why are you doing this with your time? Did you experience anything like that at the beginning of you being a writer?
Oh yeah, imposter syndrome is real. It's very real. I have it all. I still have it in some areas of my writing, mostly when I'm trying to write fiction. I've pretty much got nonfiction to, I've done it so long, I can do it with my eyes closed, and I've got the vibe for nonfiction, and I make most of my money doing corporate communications work and things that are short-term assignments that pay the bills. But when I'm trying to write long form narrative, creating worlds and basically playing God, I feel very vulnerable and very, the self-doubt tends to come in. I think in your case, it's very natural to have an inner critic, and the folks that teach writing and encourage writers and coach writers say the first thing you have to do is fire your inner critic. And everybody has the right to tell a story or to ask questions. You play music because it serves you somehow in your soul, whether anyone else hears it or not.
Yeah.
I dabble at guitar. I used to play trombone. What I love more than anything right now is to go build a deck out back or work with my hands. When I'm not working with my head, I want to go do something physically with my hands. I'm a beekeeper. I raise honey. Just something completely different from what I do for a living. And in your case, you fly planes and you make music because you love it and you feel like it gives you joy. In this case, this is helping you sort out the world. It gives you a license to be curious and to ask people, it's like, Brad, why should I want to talk to Brad. How can I get him to spend an hour plus with me? Well, if I have a podcast, then there's a structure that gives me a license to ask Brad a bunch of nosy questions.
Exactly. That's exactly it. And I found that, that's the other impetus here. I am a really gregarious guy and I am highly extroverted. And it's like, I need some place to put my attention, that I hope will be, my highest hope for this, is just that somebody else might if someone else listens and is interested and entertained, well, then I've won. What would really make me just ecstatically joyful is if somebody shared this with someone they knew who was looking to become a writer, and it somehow helps them, set forth down a productive path in life. That's what I'm hoping for here. And that's kind of why I'm choosing the people that I'm choosing. Because, I just think, I'll say we're all, but I know it's really about me. I was just spending way too much time focusing that attention in unhealthy places, and I think it's a struggle that we're all dealing with right now. Like, I'm not one of these people who says, oh, I wish we could go back to the days before the internet and social media. We as a collective, society and a collective human consciousness, we got to figure out how to deal with this new technology healthily. And this is my answer.
Right now I'm teaching myself to make movies. So that's my answer.
Really?
Yep. I'm producing a documentary on the Nebraska crew, which is where those oars come from behind me. I did a 3-hour literary festival last year where we couldn't meet in person. So I interviewed 30 writers and produced and did all of the After Effects and Adobe Premiere and produced that. I'm basically having to do the segments that I do as part of the Truck Boss Show and after a series I do on atypical learners for Beacon College called A World of Difference. I've just learned to become a storyteller in video as well. And that's kind of where I'm stretching and growing. And I think as long as you're doing something to feed your soul, in addition to putting the cheese on the macaroni for a living, I think you're on the right track.
Will you do me a favor? Will you send me links, photos, any media of the stuff you're looking on that you'd like, kind of thrown out there into the world?
Sure.
And it'll help me with my liner notes for this episode.
All right. Well, Scott, it has been an absolute pleasure, and I appreciate you thinking of me. I wish I had had a chance to know your dad or to talk to him for the book. I know that that Dick Vaux thought the world of him, and in fact dedicated the book to him.
That's the last thing that I'll say, and I might even get teary-eyed. I remember, what a gift this was when I received it, and I shared the dedication to one of my friends, and the dedication of the book says to James Corley, a good friend and fine aviator. And my friend, who's a fellow pilot for United Airlines, he just commented on what a perfect line that was, just the economy of words, and he said that's all he would want for a colleague to say about him, and I really appreciated that. It was very cool to hear this book and read your account and hear this story that I've heard my whole life from a fresh and different perspective, and thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me.
Absolutely. Fair skies and tailwinds, my friend.
All right, thanks a lot, Brad.
Bye-bye.
Talk to you soon. Bye.